Hello everyone, welcome to the fourth video of how to install a 2AR-FE into your Toyota MR2 Spyder. Today we're going to be buttoning up everything in the engine bay. The only thing going to be left for the next video is going to be the interior work and a test drive. So let's go ahead and get started. The first thing we need to do is install the starter. Now that the starter's in, we've got this cable bracket for the shifter. You're going to want to put this spring clip on there also. You can put this on afterwards, but it's easier to put it on now. Note, the starter that's on here right now is from the 2010 through 2011 2AR from the Camry. Some of the Scion starters are a little bit longer, and this won't fit. So if your starter is too long, you need to get a different one. I don't know which aftermarket starters are going to be the right length or not. I just know the factory 2010 through 2011 Camry starter at a minimum is good. Next, we're going to grab the shift cables. You'll notice in here they're already installed, but there's these spherical bearings that came with the shift kit. These are custom made specifically for this. And there's these large snap rings. There's little grooves on the outside. The snap rings go in the grooves, and you can see there's a snap ring on top and a snap ring on the bottom. Do that to both shift cables. It's time to install the shorter shift cable. This is the one that goes forward and back. You can just check in the cabin. So we can move this one out of the way. The shorter one goes right here, but before we put it here, there's these little wave washers. Drop one right on here first. So we do that, and then that clip that we put in earlier, it just kind of snaps right in place. And then this goes on top. From there, we put another wave washer, and then one of these washers, in case the whole bearing falls apart, that'll stop the shift cable from coming off. And then a retention clip. And you'll have to push down a little bit because those wave washers have a little bit of tension. And then you can now shift. Well, at least shift into third and fourth. Now we're going to do the cross gauge shift linkage, the left to right cable, which is going to be the other cable. Now this has to run underneath this coolant pipe. It's a little tight on the routing, and you don't need to move this quite as far out of the way, but I'm just trying to show you. That bracket we installed when we installed the transmission, this just gets clipped right in place there. And it's a little on the short side. So if it feels tight and annoying to put in, well, I'm sorry, it's just the way it is. Next, we're going to install the cross-gate belt crank. It gets put together with parts in the kit. Don't forget the wave washers in between here. The length on here we're going to set in just a minute, so don't worry about it too much for now. And this bolt here, don't forget there's a washer on top and a washer on the bottom. And there should be a little bit of play here, otherwise things will get tight and you won't be able to shift properly. Something else to note that's very important is you have to put Loctite on here. In theory, with those Teflon bushings, nothing should move, but if ever there's too much friction in there and you unscrew this, it'll just be bad news all around. Personally, for this, I'm a fan of blue Loctite, and it's going to be going on this post right here. Then the shift cable underneath will reach. It's a little hard to see, but don't forget wave washer, cable, wave washer, retention washer, and retention clip. So that all gets put together on that cable to connect the shift cable to the belt crank. Next, we need to adjust the length between these heims. What you want to do is set this so that it's in a neutral position, right? So this is not in gear right now, and this just finds its center. Move this until it's at its rest position inside the cabin, and you just want this to just slip right on there without any tension. And then, because we haven't done the piece on the inside yet, you want to unscrew one entire turn and put it on like that. And then you're going to put, again, the spring washers, the retention washer, and the clip. And now you should be able to go into the cabin and shift. Note, there's still a tiny piece we're missing on the inside, which will actually make the shifting center field much better. You should go inside and check. You can shift into reverse. If you can't shift into reverse, you're going to want to extend it by about a half turn at a time until you can get into reverse. Now let's hook up our fuel line. This is that Earl's 5/16 adapter. It fits on here, but it can't ever be removed because of the way it works. And we're going to thread it on right at the AN fitting here. Always use 2 wrenches when tightening an AN fitting. Next thing we want to put in there is this custom formed rubber hose. And again, we're going to use these ratcheting pliers. This is going to be a lot easier because these are going to be the larger clips you're going to use. And now let's get part of the electrical done. Remember, this is my race car harness. Yours is actually going to look like this. This is the wire harness we made earlier. This is going to go through the top hole on the left side of the engine bay over there. You're going to seat this, and you're going to plug this into the ECU. And also, there's going to be this plug, and you're going to plug that into the ECU. And don't forget to plug your starter solenoid wire in also. This next step is going to be one that's going to be a little bit different for you than for me. There's going to be a fuse box right there in your car, and you're going to have this cable that comes out. Mine's got 2 cables here, but you're only going to have one. And you're going to route this cable into this fuse box and hook it up. Yours is going to look like this, and what you're going to have to do to make it fit is you're actually going to have to straighten this out, and just grab some pliers and do it. And then there's going to be a notch right in the fuse box that's going to stop you from putting this in. Either cut the notch with some small cutters, or use a file and grind the notch right into this, and then it'll just bolt right in. Next, we'll reach into the pile of things we had when we did the wiring harness. One of the things we pulled out was this loose wire for the starter. We're going to use this. Right now we're not going to plug anything into the other end, but we're going to plug this onto the starter and just dangle it right off the back of the transmission. Next, we're going to tackle the coolant lines. You're going to need some small adapters because the coolant lines on the motor are actually much bigger than the coolant lines on the pressure reservoir on the MR2 Spyder. Then it's simply a question of the hose in front goes to the bottom port on the pressure reservoir, and the hose here goes to the top port on the pressure reservoir. Unlike this race car, you'll actually probably want heat in your car. What you also need to do is on this back one, you need to tee into it, and there's a hose right down there, right below the ECU. You're going to want that tee to go there and also to the top port on the pressure reservoir. This is your mass airflow branch here, so keep that tucked out of the way. And we just want to move the electrical wire so that it's not dangling on top of the shift linkage. What we're just going to use is a zip tie right through the part of the motor mount here. Now be careful, there's going to be something on top of here, so don't put the zip tie in the way. Just kind of put it to the side here. Just like that. We're going to need to get the brake booster plugged in. I really like this Earl's Vapor Guard. It stops your engine bay and an engine swap from smelling like gasoline. You'll have 2 ports up here. The one on the right is going to be for your brake booster. The other one is the evap. It doesn't exist on this car, but we'll still cover it. this piece is going to be 45 inches long, give or take. And the other end of this hose, there's a port over on the right side of the intake. That's what it's made for. Alright, next thing we're going to do is attach the mass airflow sensor to the mass airflow tube and the mass airflow tube to the mass airflow sensor bracket. The provided fasteners, you will not have washers underneath here because I actually provide shorter bolts than are on this one. And you'll notice when this is installed, this installs on top of the motor mount, but the mass airflow sensor is towards the bottom. It's a little inconvenient, but it meant that these mass airflow wires are not going to need to be extended, which would actually double the number of crimps that you would have needed to do in the harness for the work. So trying to keep it simple. So let's go ahead and bolt this on. And note, you don't want the filter on there when you're bolting it on initially. So you got the 2 bolts on the motor mount and the third one on the ECU bracket. And now we'll take care of the intake tube. The thing to note about this is actually out of the 2010 and 11 Toyota Camry, not the Scion TC. It actually probably goes into more years than that, but there's a couple reasons for that. First, it's shorter, which means that your air filter isn't hitting the fuse box that is normally here. And the other thing is it's got this resonator, which actually does quiet down the intake quite a bit. It has the purge solenoid right here and the stock hose, which will plug in down there. So go ahead and attach that. And then the crankcase ventilation hose. And then we hook up a little bit of electrical. You've got your mass airflow sensor wire and your purge solenoid. Just plug those in. And I'm not sure if the length of this wire changes. I think it does on some installations, so you might actually need to extend this wire. It's just 2 wires. Alternately, you can move the solenoid. But then what you need to do is there's going to be a pipe down here that I've got plugged there. But there's also going to be a pipe right about here on your car. You need to connect both of those, and that's going to allow the evap system to work. And at this point, we're going to put the air filter. The air filter supplied with the kit is a little bit shorter to clear the fuse box. If you are using an race application, it's always a better idea to use a bigger filter. But this goes in afterwards. And with the fuse box there, it's even harder to get that filter in there, but it does all fit. And the next thing on the list is our axles. So it doesn't matter which side you start with. We're going to put the inners in first. And when you're putting them in, try to be careful not to damage the seal. And this side goes in with 2 bolts. Then we'll put the other side in. This one's retained with a clip, so make sure the clip is in, and it helps a tiny bit. So there's an opening in the clip. If you put that towards the bottom, it'll usually help it slip in a little bit easier. It's not really critical, but it just helps a little bit sometimes. And there it is. Next, let's install the cross member. With this mount already here, that'll actually help partially support things. Just makes things a little easier. And then the bolt for the mount should just go right in. Then we get the ABS cable brackets. Next we put our CV shafts in. And now we have to deal with the battery. The first thing to do is you have to ground the transmission to the chassis. And the reason for that is because that's where the starter gets its power from. In my case, I've got this wire right here because this is where my battery is. Now, in most of your cases, you're actually going to want to ground to the body because that's where your battery is going to be grounded to instead of this little lug here. But if you do a setup like I've got where your battery is actually grounded to your crossmember, you still want to ground to your body also. You just don't need as big of a wire since that's not supporting your starting load. So in my case, I'm going to put these two wires here and I'm going to ground them in there. And there's a bunch of little spare holes here and there on the transmission. Just pick one. And then we finally get to the battery. Now, this setup here is one of those because race car setups. There are a few other options in the MR2 aftermarket for crossmember mounted batteries. You probably don't want this battery. This is just a tiny Odyssey battery, and it works great for a race car, but it would die really quick in a daily driver application. And now we need to hook up the positive and negative on the battery. Your setup isn't going to be exactly like this, but it's pretty easy to talk through. Essentially, you need to hook up the negative to where it went in the factory application and make sure that there's a wire going from the negative of the battery directly or from a spot where it attaches to the chassis that goes to the transmission, because you've got all the starter power going through there. That's about 200 amps. And then your positive, you've got two positives you've got to hook up. You've got the one that goes to the fuse box up there, and then, do you remember the starter wire we hooked up earlier? In my case, I'm actually also drawing power for the vehicle on there, but you'll have two wires, one for the fuse box, one for your starter. And just plug them in. Of course, never forget wire management. Your wire routing will look a little bit different, of course, because your battery setup will be a little bit different, but at the end of the day, no matter what your battery setup is, you don't want things rubbing against the positive battery terminals. And now's a good time to fill the transmission oil. Actually, looking at this before we installed this battery would have been a good time, but whatever. Since we just serviced the transmission, we don't actually have to take the fill plug out of the front. The fill plug out of the front is the one that you're supposed to watch weep for when the transmission is full, but since we've serviced this thing, we know that it's 100% bone dry and its capacity is 2.5 quarts. So there's another plug back here that is way easier to get to put oil into, and that's what we're going to use. And of course, don't forget your engine oil. I use this Klotz 5W20 in here. It's what I've been running in here for a good long time. It works great if you're on the racetrack. Keep in mind, if you're running a catalytic converter, the high levels of ZDDP in this stuff will kill your catalytic converters. So only use this stuff if you don't have catalytic converters. And frankly, it's a bit overkill if you're running a car on the street. But this car sees full throttle for, up to 24 hours at a time. And sway bar. Moving right along, we get the bumper bar. Next part we come along is the second do-it-yourself part of the swap. With the header, you'll have received a V-band flange and a V-band clamp. Obviously that's not enough to be an exhaust system, but the car is somewhat drivable right now, though it is loud, but you'll be able to get it on a trailer and you can drive it to an exhaust shop. This is a pretty easy job for somebody to do. It just needs to go completely underneath the car. For the race car, what I did is I just put that, a flex, and a vibrant muffler, and a tailpipe. This is brutally loud. You'll want more muffler than that in most cases. The other thing to keep in mind is the flange comes off at what might seem initially like a weird angle. It's about a 45-degree angle. The intent for that is to get it as far away from the gas tank as possible. In case there's a failure at the clamp, it won't be shooting hot gases on your gas tank. But by making it a 45-degree angle, if you want to put a catalytic converter underneath the motor, you can go straight a little bit and then go right putting it underneath the motor. Otherwise, you can go straight to a 45-degree angle, go straight back, and you'll be able to have as much clearance as possible. So let's go ahead and install this. And now it's time to do the clutch line. And if you've had issues with those brass nuts stripping, these Knipex flat pliers are fantastic to do the job. They'll put on and take off undamaged as well as damaged bolts, so something good to keep in mind. And while you're underneath there, 8mm wrench, and you're going to loosen the bleeder valve. So unfortunately there's no good camera angle to show you what I'm doing here. And now we need to bleed the clutch. Personally, I like this 600 plus fluid, especially for racing. This stuff tends to work really well. And keep in mind, our clutch line is in somewhere that it's going to get hot. And then to bleed the system, since I do this at every race, I've picked up a way to cheat. Take the dust cover off and take this out. What we're going to do, we're going to fill the reservoir just all the way to the top. Don't worry about the fill line. And then remember the bleeder valves open at the back. Then we're going to put the cap back on. And then use air pressure in that hole, just a tiny little bit of air pressure. If you put too much, that's what it'll do. It'll just pop off a little bit. But it takes a little bit to get it to flow at first, because for some reason when the line is dry it doesn't want to flow as well. And you're just going to keep doing that until you've run through, about 3 or 4 containers full. Not containers, but the reservoir's full. And make sure you don't let it get empty. And check to see if you can see any falling on the ground. Yep, we've got some falling on the ground. We're going to close the bleeder. We're going to pump the pedal a couple times and then reopen the bleeder and repeat this procedure. And we're just going to repeat this a couple times. And again, close the line. And up the clutch. And reopen the line. And we're going to close that off and we should be good to go. We'll have to wait for the test drive, but the clutch pedal feels great. the dust cover back on. Put the splash overflow thing back in. And close this off. And you'll want to take a second to clean up around there, because that stuff is pretty corrosive to paint. And the last fluid we got to take care of is coolant. This is a vacuum bleeder kit. If you're doing coolant in an MR2 with any other way, you're wasting your time. So the only downside is this is a bit loud, so I'm going to mute it for a bit. Alright, and now you give it a second, make sure you're not leaking. We're holding 23 inches of vacuum. Thinking we're looking pretty good. And just flip the switch. The only tricky part about this is to not let the container get empty. Oh, also, this Go5 coolant I'm using, this is not a recommendation. I would recommend the Toyota Pink Long Life coolant. The reason I'm using this is because I race this car and I have to flush the coolant and refill it, and this stuff is almost clear. The problem is if I have the pink coolant in here and I'm flushing and I refill it, the pink is a little too obvious. It stays in there, so I have to flush it a half dozen times to get rid of enough pink so that I can pass tech, whereas with this I can just drain it once, refill it, and it's clear enough that it passes tech. It's just a minor thing, and this is better than not running any coolant. I won't, while I do run straight water at the track, I refuse to run straight water in this motor year round. It's just not good for the motor. Ask anybody that races regularly, they'll tell you the same thing. When they open up the motor, it's full of rust. So every once in a while, we're going to change the container. And there we go. The system is bled. It's that easy. And just check, make sure your reservoir is topped off. In my case it is. Sometimes you'll have to put it in like the last quart or so, the old-fashioned way. But that's it. As I said, if you're doing your coolant any other way in an MR2, you're wasting your time. All right. Well, that's everything now. We've got the fourth video done. The only thing you've got left to wrap up back here is things like tail lights, the engine hood, the back bumper cover, the strut bar, and I'll leave that stuff up to you. It's nothing very complicated. Episode 5 is going to be the interior work. That one's going to be a pretty short episode, and hopefully I'll get around to putting a test drive in there. So, it depends on what the footage ends up looking like. Either way, we'll see you guys shortly. Have a good one.